Introduction. The Law of the Sierra Nevada. In the wild, untamed frontier of California during the 1850s, the line between justice and chaos was as thin as a blade of grass. The gold rush had brought fortune seekers, dreamers, and settlers to the west, but it had also drawn outlaws, drifters, and men who thrived on violence. Towns like San Miguel, nestled in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada, were caught in the crossfire, places where the law was fragile, and survival often depended on the strength of a sheriff's badge and the courage of those who wore it. This is the story of Sheriff Billy Granger, a man who carried the weight of the law on his shoulders in a land where lawlessness reigned. Granger wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He was a man of grit and resolve, hardened by years of chasing criminals and burying friends. But when Cassidy Durham and his gang of outlaws, the Black River Boys, began their reign of terror, Granger found himself facing a challenge unlike any he had ever known. Durham wasn't just a thief or a killer. He was a force of nature, a man who thrived on fear and chaos, and whose gang seemed unstoppable. The battle between Granger and Durham wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for the soul of San Miguel. The people of the town, weary and afraid, looked to Granger to protect them, to stand against the tide of violence that threatened to consume them all. But the cost of justice would be high, and the road to it would be paved with blood. This book is a tale of courage and desperation, of men who lived and died by the gun, and of a sheriff who refused to back down, even when the odds were stacked against him. It is a story of the Old West, where the law was often as wild as the land itself, and where the fight for justice was never clean or easy. In the end, it is a story about choices, the choices that define us, the choices that haunt us, and the choices that determine whether we stand or fall. For in a place like San Miguel, where the dust never truly settles, the law and the outlaw are often two sides of the same coin, and sometimes the only way to bring peace is to walk through the fire. Chapter 1. The Dust Settles. The sun hung low over the Sierra Nevada, casting long shadows across the dry, cracked earth. A warm wind carried the scent of sagebrush and the faint tang of gunpowder. It was 1851, and California was still raw from the gold rush, a land of opportunity for some, and a lawless frontier for others. In the small town of San Miguel, nestled between the rolling hills and the promise of gold, the line between right and wrong was as thin as the dust that coated every surface. Sheriff Billy Granger leaned against the weathered post of his office, his hat tipped low to shield his eyes from the glare. He was a tall man, with a wiry frame and a face carved by years of hard living. His badge, dulled by time, caught the light as he watched the main street of San Miguel. It was quiet now, but Granger knew better than to trust the calm. Trouble had a way of finding this town, and lately it had been coming in the form of a man named Cassidy Durham. Cassidy Durham was a name whispered in saloons and around campfires, a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm cloud. He was said to be a former prospector turned outlaw, a man who had traded his pickaxe for a Colt revolver. Durham and his gang, the Black River Boys, had been terrorizing the region for months, robbing stagecoaches, rustling cattle, and leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. Granger had never seen Durham in person, but he had seen the aftermath of his work. It was enough to make a man lose sleep. As Granger stood there, the sound of hoofbeats broke the stillness. A rider approached, his horse kicking up a cloud of dust as it galloped into town. The man pulled up sharply in front of the sheriff's office, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Sheriff Granger," the man called, dismounting in a hurry. "They hit the Carson ranch last night, took the cattle, burned the barn, and left old man Carson for dead." Granger straightened, his jaw tightening. "Cassidy Durham?" The man nodded. "Who else? They were headed west toward the river. You've got to stop them, Sheriff. They'll bleed this town dry if you don't." Granger sighed, the weight of the badge heavy on his chest. He had been chasing shadows for weeks, always one step behind Durham and his gang. But this was different. The Carsons were good people, hard-working folks who had come west to build a life. Granger couldn't let this stand. "Get yourself some water," he said to the rider. "I'll round up a posse." The man nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief. Granger turned and stepped into his office, where his deputy, a young man named Tom Harlan, was cleaning a rifle. "Tom," Granger said, grabbing his own gun belt from the wall. "We've got work to do. Durham hit the Carson place last night." Tom looked up, his boyish face hardening. "You think we can catch him this time?" Granger buckled his belt and checked his revolver. "We don't have a choice." Within the hour, Granger and Tom had gathered a small group of men, ranchers, miners, and shopkeepers, all armed and ready to defend their town. They rode out as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. The trail was fresh, the tracks of Durham's gang leading west toward the Black River. As they rode, Granger couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into a trap. Durham was no fool, and he had a knack for staying one step ahead. But Granger also knew that the people of San Miguel were counting on him. He couldn't let fear stop him. The posse reached the river just as darkness fell. The water glistened in the moonlight, and the air was thick with the sound of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Granger held up a hand, signaling the men to stop. He dismounted and crouched low, studying the ground. The tracks were there, leading into a grove of cottonwoods. "They're close," he whispered. "Stay quiet and keep your eyes open." The men nodded, their faces tense. They moved forward on foot, their guns at the ready. The grove was dark, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to shift and move. Granger's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the area, every sense on high alert. And then he saw it, a flicker of light through the trees, a campfire. Granger motioned for the men to spread out, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. They crept closer, the firelight growing brighter with each step. Voices drifted through the night, low and rough. It was Durham and his men, laughing and talking as if they didn't have a care in the world. Granger took a deep breath, his grip tightening on his revolver. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He stepped into the clearing, his badge catching the firelight. "Cassidy Durham," he called, his voice steady and firm. "You're under arrest." The laughter stopped. The men around the fire froze, their hands hovering near their guns. Durham stood slowly, a smirk on his face. He was a tall man with a lean build and a face that was both handsome and cruel. His eyes glinted in the firelight as he looked at Granger. "Well, well," Durham said, his voice smooth and mocking. "Sheriff Granger, I was wondering when you'd show up." Granger didn't flinch. "It's over, Durham. Lay down your weapons and come quietly." Durham chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "I don't think so, Sheriff. You see, I've got the upper hand here." As if on cue, the shadows around the clearing came alive. More men stepped out from the darkness, their guns trained on the posse. Granger's heart sank. Durham had been expecting them. "Drop your weapons," Durham said, his smirk widening. "Unless you want to see your men cut down where they stand." Granger hesitated, his mind racing. He had walked right into Durham's trap, and now the lives of his men were in his hands. Slowly, he lowered his gun, the weight of defeat heavy in his chest. But as he did, a shot rang out, shattering the silence. Chaos erupted as the posse and Durham's men opened fire, the night lit up by the flash of gunfire. Granger dove for cover, his heart pounding as he returned fire. The battle had begun, and there was no turning back. Chapter 2. Blood in the Cottonwoods. The night exploded with gunfire, the sharp cracks of revolvers and the deeper booms of rifles echoing through the grove. Sheriff Billy Granger dove behind a fallen log, his heart pounding as bullets whizzed past him, splintering bark and kicking up dirt. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the shouts of men filled the darkness. "Hold your ground!" Granger shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He fired blindly into the shadows, aiming for the flashes of muzzle fire. Around him, the posse scrambled for cover, their faces pale but determined. These were not soldiers. They were ranchers and shopkeepers, men who had never faced anything like this. But they fought with the desperation of those who had no choice. Tom Harlan, Granger's young deputy, crouched beside him, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. "They've got us pinned, Sheriff!" he yelled, his voice barely audible over the din. "What do we do?" Granger gritted his teeth, his mind racing. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but retreat wasn't an option. If they let Cassidy Durham and his gang escape now, they might never get another chance. He glanced around, taking stock of the situation. Two of the posse were already down, their bodies sprawled in the dirt. He didn't have time to mourn them. "Flank them!" Granger barked. "Tom, take a couple of men and circle around to the left. I'll keep them busy here." Tom hesitated, his eyes wide with fear, but he nodded. "Got it, Sheriff." He motioned to two of the posse, and the three of them slipped into the shadows, moving low and fast. Granger turned his attention back to the fight. He could see the Black River boys scattered among the trees, their faces lit by the flickering firelight. They were a rough-looking bunch, hardened by years of outlaw living. But they weren't invincible. Granger took aim and fired, his shot catching one of the gang in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground, his gun falling from his hand. Another of the Black River boys, a burly man with a thick beard, charged toward Granger, his revolver blazing. Granger ducked as a bullet grazed his hat, then fired twice in quick succession. The man stumbled, clutching his side, and fell face first into the dirt. The tide of the battle seemed to shift, if only for a moment. The posse, emboldened by Granger's example, fought back with renewed vigor. One of the ranchers, a wiry man named Caleb, took down another of the gang with a well-placed shot. The Black River boys were starting to falter, their numbers thinning. But Cassidy Durham was nowhere to be seen. Granger scanned the grove, his eyes searching for the outlaw leader. He spotted movement near the edge of the clearing, a group of men slipping away into the darkness. Durham was among them, his tall frame unmistakable even in the dim light. "Durham's running!" Granger shouted. "Don't let him get away!" He broke cover and sprinted after them, his revolver in hand. The remaining posse followed, their boots pounding against the earth. But the Black River boys had planned their escape well. As Granger and his men closed in, a volley of gunfire erupted from the shadows, forcing them to dive for cover. By the time the dust settled, Durham and his men were gone. Granger stood slowly, his chest heaving as he surveyed the scene. The grove was littered with bodies. 3 of the Black River boys lay dead, their lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. 2 of the posse had fallen as well, their blood soaking into the earth. The survivors stood in stunned silence, their faces pale and their hands trembling. Tom Harlan approached, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "They're gone, Sheriff," he said quietly. "Durham and the rest of them. Must have been at least 40 of them." Granger nodded, his jaw tight. "We'll bury our dead and head back to town. This isn't over." Tom hesitated. "You think we'll get another shot at him?" Granger's eyes hardened. "We have to. If we don't stop Durham, no one will." The posse worked through the night, digging graves for their fallen comrades. The mood was somber, the weight of their failure heavy on their shoulders. By the time they returned to San Miguel, the first light of dawn was breaking over the hills. Granger dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, his body aching and his mind racing. He had underestimated Cassidy Durham. The outlaw was more than just a thief and a killer. He was a strategist, a man who knew how to use the land and his men to his advantage. Granger would have to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless if he wanted to bring him down. As he stepped into his office, Granger made a silent vow. He would not rest until Cassidy Durham and the Black River boys were brought to justice, no matter the cost. Chapter 3. Shadows in San Miguel. The town of San Miguel was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that settled in after a long night of trouble. The townsfolk were still reeling from the news of the ambush at the Black River. Word had spread quickly. 3 of the Black River boys were dead, but so were 2 of the posse. Cassidy Durham and the rest of his gang had escaped, and the sheriff's office was no closer to stopping their reign of terror. Inside the general store, old Mr. Hargrove was busy restocking shelves. The store was the heart of San Miguel, a place where miners, ranchers, and townsfolk alike came to trade stories and buy what they needed to survive. Hargrove had run the store for nearly 20 years, and though he was well into his 60s, he still worked with the energy of a younger man. His helper, a boy of 12 named Frankie, was sweeping the floor near the counter, humming a tune as he worked. "Frankie," Hargrove said, his voice gruff but kind, "when you're done with that, go check the storeroom. We're running low on flour, and I need to know how much we've got left." "Yes, sir," Frankie replied, flashing a gap-toothed grin. He liked working for Hargrove. The old man treated him well, and the store was a safe place, a refuge from the rough edges of frontier life. But safety was an illusion in San Miguel. The door to the store swung open with a jingle of the bell, and 8 men stepped inside. They were dusty and rough-looking, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. At the head of the group was Joe Stone, one of Cassidy Durham's most trusted lieutenants. Stone was a hulking man with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of a knife fight he'd won years ago. His eyes were cold and calculating as he surveyed the store. "Morning, gentlemen," Hargrove said, his tone wary. He recognized Stone immediately and his heart sank. "What can I do for you?" Stone stepped forward, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. "We're here for supplies," he said, his voice low and menacing. "And we're not paying!" Hargrove's hand twitched toward the shotgun he kept under the counter, but he stopped himself. There were 8 of them, and he was an old man. He wouldn't stand a chance. "Take what you need," he said, his voice tight. "Just leave the boy out of it." Stone smirked. That's the spirit, old man. No need to make this harder than it has to be. The gang spread out, grabbing sacks of flour, tins of beans, and whatever else they could carry. One of them emptied the cash register, stuffing the coins into a leather pouch. Frankie watched from the corner, his broom clutched tightly in his hands. His heart was pounding, but he didn't dare move. As the men loaded up, Stone turned back to Hargrove. "You've been real cooperative," he said, his tone mocking. "But there's one more thing we need." Hargrove frowned. "What's that?" Stone's smirk turned into a sneer. "A message for Sheriff Granger." Before Hargrove could react, Stone drew his revolver and fired. The shot echoed through the store, and Hargrove collapsed behind the counter, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. Frankie let out a cry, dropping his broom as he stumbled backward. Stone turned to the boy, his expression cold. "You're coming with us, kid. Sheriff Granger needs to know what happens when he crosses Cassidy Durham." Frankie shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. "No, please." One of the gang grabbed him by the arm, dragging him toward the door. Frankie struggled, kicking and screaming, but he was no match for the man's strength. Stone holstered his gun and tipped his hat to the lifeless body of Hargrove. "Let's go," he said to his men. "We've got what we came for." The gang mounted their horses. Frankie hoisted onto the saddle in front of one of the riders. As they galloped out of town, the townsfolk emerged from their homes and shops, drawn by the sound of the gunshot. They stared in horror as the gang disappeared into the distance, their dust cloud lingering in the air. Sheriff Granger arrived moments later, his face grim as he pushed through the growing crowd and stepped into the store. He found Hargrove's body behind the counter, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Granger knelt beside him, his jaw tightening as he took in the scene. Tom Harlan appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Sheriff, it was the Black River boys. Joe Stone was leading them. They took Frankie." Granger stood slowly, his fists clenched at his sides. "They're sending a message," he said, his voice low and steady. "But they've made a mistake." Tom frowned. "What do you mean?" Granger's eyes burned with determination. "They think they can scare us into giving up, but all they've done is give me another reason to bring them down." He turned to the crowd gathered outside, his voice rising. "Joe Stone and the Black River boys will pay for this, I swear it." The townsfolk murmured among themselves, their fear mingled with a flicker of hope. Granger was their sheriff, and if anyone could stand up to the Black River boys, it was him. But as he stepped out into the sunlight, Granger knew the road ahead would be long and bloody. The gang was growing bolder, and the stakes were higher than ever. He would need more men, more firepower, and more resolve than he'd ever mustered before. Because Cassidy Durham and his gang weren't just outlaws, they were a plague on San Miguel, and Granger wouldn't rest until every last one of them was brought to justice. Chapter 4. Justice in Chains. The sun was high in the sky when Sheriff Billy Granger and his posse rode back into San Miguel, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they entered the main street. Behind them, tied to their saddles with thick ropes, were 4 of the Black River boys. Their faces were bruised and bloodied, their hands bound tightly in front of them. The townsfolk gathered along the street, their murmurs growing louder as they caught sight of the prisoners. Granger dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, his face grim. The past 2 days had been a relentless pursuit, tracking the gang through the hills and canyons west of the Black River. The posse had finally caught up with a small group of them, 4 men who had split off from the main gang, likely to avoid the heat of the law. The fight to capture them had been short but brutal, leaving one of the posse wounded and the outlaws worse for wear. "Get them inside," Granger said, motioning to his deputy, Tom Harlan, and the other men. "We'll lock them up until the judge gets here." Tom nodded, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He and 2 others dragged the prisoners off their horses and marched them into the jailhouse. The crowd outside pressed closer, their voices rising with questions and demands. "Are they going to hang, Sheriff?" one man called out. "Did they kill Hargrove?" shouted another. Granger raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "These men will stand trial," he said firmly. "We'll let the law decide their fate, but I promise you this, justice will be served." The crowd murmured in agreement, though some faces still showed doubt. San Miguel had seen too many outlaws escape justice, too many promises broken. But Granger's reputation carried weight, and for now, the townsfolk were willing to trust him. Inside the jailhouse, the 4 prisoners were shoved into 2 cells, their hands still bound. The cells were small and cramped, with iron bars that had seen better days. Granger stood in the doorway, his arms crossed as he studied the men. They were a rough-looking bunch, their clothes torn and their faces hardened by years of outlaw living. One of them, a wiry man with a crooked nose, glared at Granger with open defiance. "You think this changes anything, Sheriff?" the man sneered. "Cassidy'll come for us. You can count on that." Granger stepped closer, his eyes cold. "Cassidy Durham doesn't scare me, and if he's fool enough to come back to San Miguel, I'll be waiting for him." The man smirked, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Granger turned to Tom, who was standing by the desk. "Keep an eye on them," he said. "I'm going to send word to Judge Whitaker. He'll want to get here as soon as possible." Tom nodded. "You think the judge will hang him?" Granger's jaw tightened. "If the evidence is strong enough, he will. But that's for the court to decide." Granger left the jailhouse and headed to the telegraph office, his mind racing. The capture of these 4 men was a victory, but it was a small one. Cassidy Durham and the rest of the Black River Boys were still out there, and they wouldn't take this lightly. Granger knew the gang would be planning their next move, and he had to be ready. By the time the sun set, the town was buzzing with anticipation. Judge Whitaker was expected to arrive within 2 days, and the trial would be held in the saloon, the only building in town big enough to accommodate the crowd. Granger spent the evening preparing, going over the evidence and questioning the prisoners. None of them were willing to talk, but Granger didn't need their confessions. The townsfolk had seen them with the gang, and their capture with stolen supplies from the general store was damning enough. The next morning, Granger stood on the porch of the jailhouse, watching the town wake up. The air was cool and still, but there was a tension that hung over San Miguel like a storm cloud. He knew the trial would be a turning point, not just for the prisoners, but for the town itself. If the law could hold firm here, it would send a message to the Black River Boys and every other outlaw in the region. But if it failed, Granger pushed the thought aside. He couldn't afford to think that way. He had to believe in the law, even in a place as wild and untamed as San Miguel. As the day wore on, the prisoners grew restless. The man with the crooked nose, who Granger had learned was named Eli Carter, spent most of the day pacing his cell, muttering under his breath. The others were quieter, their faces grim as they stared at the walls or the floor. Granger kept a close watch on them, his hand never far from his revolver. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a rider approached the town at a gallop. It was one of the ranchers who had joined the posse, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Sheriff," the man called as he dismounted. "I saw smoke. Big campfire about 10 miles out. Could be Durham and the rest of his gang." Granger's stomach tightened. He had expected a response from Durham, but not this soon. "How many men?" he asked. "Couldn't tell," the rancher said, "but it looked like a big group." Granger nodded, his mind racing. He couldn't leave the prisoners unguarded, but he also couldn't ignore the possibility of an attack. He turned to Tom, who had come out to see what was happening. "Tom, double the guard on the jailhouse," Granger said. "I'll take a few men and check it out. If anything happens, you hold this place. Understand?" Tom nodded, his face pale but determined. "I've got it, Sheriff." Granger mounted his horse and rode out with 3 men, their rifles at the ready. The night was dark and quiet, the only sound the steady rhythm of hooves on the dirt road. As they approached the area the rancher had described, Granger's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the gang. In the distance, he saw it, a faint glow, just over the ridge. He signaled for the men to stop, his hand tightening on the reins. "We'll go the rest of the way on foot," he said. "Stay quiet." They dismounted and crept forward, their boots crunching softly against the dry earth. As they reached the top of the ridge, Granger peered down into the valley below. There, around a roaring campfire, was a group of men, at least 20 of them. It was Cassidy Durham and the Black River Boys. Granger's heart pounded as he took in the scene. The gang was armed and ready, their horses tethered nearby. They were too many to take on with just 4 men, but Granger had seen enough. He motioned for the others to retreat, his mind already working on a plan. As they rode back to San Miguel, Granger knew the next few days would be critical. The trial would go on, but the town had to be ready for what came next. Durham wouldn't let his men hang without a fight, and Granger would need every ounce of courage and cunning to face what was coming. Justice was within reach, but the cost would be high. Thanks for riding along, partner. If you enjoyed this tale from the wild frontier, give us a like and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Until next time, keep your boots dusty and your aim true.